Good evening, everybody, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the 54th episode of Dhammapariyesanā, where in which we've been actually discussing very interesting and insightful topics, both from scholarly and professional, non-professional perspectives. And today you are joining with another interesting episode, especially about translations of Buddhist texts. As you can see, the title suggests translations of Buddhist texts, challenges and opportunities. This is such a wonderful topic because many people, scholars, they translate the source languages, I would say, Buddhist textual languages into target languages like English, Japanese, Chinese, uh, French, and so many other languages. So we know that there are certainly challenges, and we also know that we always need to develop our talent skills to go for a better translation. I mean, going beyond problematic translations. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today's guest. As you can see, he's on the screen here, uh, Professor Udaya Prasanta Meddegama. So let me paraphrase his bio a little bit. Dr. Udaya Prasanta Meddegama is a former professor of Sinhala at the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka. In 1974, he earned a PhD in comparative literature from SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies from University of London. The thesis that he submitted was the use of language in Sinhala fiction from 1864 to 1970. Dr. Meddegama was also a senior fellow at the same university, SOAS, University of London. He also was a visiting professor at a number of prestigious academic institutions, both colleges and universities. Among them, we could see a couple institutions, Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva, New York. This is not Geneva in Europe, I think. This is Geneva in upstate New York, I think. And Bowdoin College in Maine, the US as well, and Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And also, he worked as a visiting professor at the same university where he earned his PhD, SOAS, University of London. Looking at his publications, one of the very notable publications he done was Anagata Vansadesana. This is a Sinhala work, primarily about the next full Buddha, actually, Maitreya, Buddha Maitreya. So the Chronicles Sermon to Be, that's the English title, which was published by Motilal Banarsidass, New Delhi. So that was one of his notable translations. While working as a director of the translation program at the Sri Lankan Institute of Buddhist Studies, we call it SIBA in Kandy in Sri Lanka, he also translated other books, especially some Pali books, Dika and Majjhima Nikayas, from Pali to Sinhala. I understand that Professor Udaya Meddegama also translating some other Pali works for a university in Thailand during this time. Probably he can share with us later. And he also produced English translations of a couple other very interesting and classical Sinhala work, which were written in 12th century, Sangha Sarana, Amavatura, and Dhammapariyesanā. So there are many more to discuss about your, life as an academician and as a translator, because that's why I wanted to speak to you, because you are a translator. Primarily, we can see that you are from a Sinhala translation background, but you have no problem in talking about Pali and all that. The Dhamma folks, join me in welcoming Professor Udaya Shanta Meddegama into our discussion interview today. Professor Meddegama, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you very much, Dr. Chandima, for inviting me to this discussion.
Dhamma
I'm
folks,
very
this
happy
is
to
yeah.
hear your introduction to me.
Dhamma folks, Professor Meddegama's maiden this kind of an interview is this going to be this, and I know that he has been involving in other Zoom discussions, but this is going to be his first this kind of an interview. I hope that this is going to go well as usual. Okay, so let me take a look at this subject. So our topic is going to be, as I said, translations of Buddhist texts. So it's primarily about translations. Anybody wants to translate, right? Buddhist quote books, right? From a scholar, from a serious scholar to a normal person. But the problems yet lie with challenges. These challenges are not like unfamiliar with a great scholar. So we really want to know what they are and how we can develop healthy strategies to overcome this. Translation demands a deep understanding of both grammar and culture. Because without culture, probably there may be somebody who uh, is very conscious, aware about the language, but without knowing the specific culture, if you look at the Buddhist texts, especially the cultures that it will nourish, I think a better translation might not come out. At the same time, translators should understand the rules of language as well as the habits. I mean, this is about cultural awareness of the people who spoke it. So this is that kind of a subject. So we'll first look at what challenges the translator faces, both scholars and non-scholars, and then get into the other subjects. And we are planning to discuss about challenges, and then when the translation does not go well, there will be I guess some missed problematic translations, I mean unreadable uh, problematic translation. We want to look at that too, and then finally look at some of the healthy ways to develop translations, especially Buddhist translations. Professor Meddegama, uh, what do you think about translation of Buddhist text? Just to begin this discussion.
Well, about the translation of Buddhist text, actually we can talk so many things. That this is a huge subject. Now, when we think about the spread of Buddhism in the world, we know that in every country outside of India, Buddhism was transmitted or taken through the translations. Maybe, for example, if we take Sri Lanka, Buddhism was introduced to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE by Arahant Mahinda from India. We have heard, or we can read in our chronicles, that Venerable Mahinda brought the Tripitaka or Buddhist scripture with their commentaries into Sri Lanka from India. And what he brought to Sri Lanka, we don't know clearly in which language those books were at that time. The books that were brought to Sri Lanka by Arahanto Venerable Mahinda. We hear from our ancient books and other records, they were in the language of Magadhi or Magadha language. That is the language of the Magadha country in India, Magadha state. That scholars have their doubts. Actually, Magadha or Magadhi was the original language of Buddhist texts. They think that probably in whatever language Buddha preached his doctrine, they were taken to various regions or countries in and around India in the language of the respective country or region. Like that, now we know Arahant Mahinda came from the area called Avanti in India. So he would have spoken the Avanti Prakrit or regional dialect called Avanti in India. Then before coming to Sri Lanka to introduce Buddhism, Arahant Mahinda is supposed to have visiting with his mother, who was in the Avanti area, where he spent 6 months. So after spending with his mother and relatives for 6 months, he came to Sri Lanka. With him and with the other monks accompanied him. He brought the Tripitaka with the commentaries. This has been recorded in some books written in Sri Lanka, which state that the commentaries dating from Buddha's time were brought to Sri Lanka by Venerable Mahinda. So like that, even on one occasion, Buddha has advised his disciples, monks, when you travel tour in the world, preach or teach them Dhamma or doctrine in their in the language of those people, in their native languages, so that people can understand easily my message. Like that, in Buddha's time, he had advised the monks not to use just one language, to use the languages of those various countries and regions these monks traveled to preach the Dhamma. So I mentioned this to say that even at the Buddha's time, some kind of translation would have happened. The monks who traveled to far off countries would have taken the Dharma, the translations of the doctrine and the scripture. Thereafter, also from Sri Lanka, I said that Buddhism was brought to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE. Immediately after arrival in Sri Lanka and converting the king and some persons in the capital city into Buddhism, Venerable Mahinda started a huge translation project in the country with the help of Sri Lankan scholars and monks. He may have trained them, of course. Just after 2 or 3 years after coming to the island, probably there were not enough monks to participate in this serious task of translating the Tripitaka text. But Arahant Mahinda would have taught them, trained them in translation. That is the first record, historically recorded in our country, that Buddhist texts with the commentaries were translated into the language of the Sinhala island. Like that, you may have heard Venerable Chandima that Buddhism, when it was taken outside northwestern part of India through the Silk Route and even before that to China, they translated Buddhist texts first into Sanskrit in India. Then the Sanskrit texts were taken to China, and there are some Indian monks who had learned Chinese and some Chinese who had learned Sanskrit started translating these important texts, Buddhist texts of the canon, and maybe commentaries also into Chinese. So, into whichever country Buddhism was taken, first task of the pioneer missionaries, Buddhist missionaries, was to translate the scripture into the language of that particular country.
Oh, that's quite interesting because when we talk about the Buddhist translation, it dates back to uh, even to the Shakyamuni Buddha's
Time itself.
living time. And as you said
Yeah.
that there were translations, and the problem here is that if you say that these translations were written in a language, then we may not know for sure, but probably kind of a vernacular of, I would say, kind of a Prakrit. Would that be Magadhi Prakrit or something else? And because some books mention that the sort of translations Venerable Mahinda brought in the 3rd century BCE was similar to the Sinhala Prakrit that was available in Sri Lanka, and that's why people didn't have a hard time to understand what he was trying to teach them, right? So that's one part of this question. The second part is that you were bringing up about Sakaya Nirutti, I guess, right?
Yeah,
It's
Sakaya
called the Sakai
Nirutti.
Nirutti. That means you're gonna spread it in your own language without tarnishing the original message of the Buddha. And Acharya Buddhaghosa took it to be Magadhi. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a
Yeah,
thing, but he was explaining that to be Magadhi. Sakai Nirutti is Magadhi, but there could be other views too. So, I mean, the quite interesting thing here is that there were translations at the time of the Buddha, but the problem is the particular language. And also, when Acharya Buddhaghosa came to Sri Lanka in the 5th century AD, and there must have been 8 centuries passed by. So these translations, Venerable Mahinda brought after I would say 300 years from the Buddha's demise. So it could have been, I guess, 8 centuries. I mean, when it is by the time of Acharya Buddhaghosa. So these translations pretty much were available in Sinhala. How do we understand this Sinhala kind of? Because Acharya Buddhaghosa translated the Sinhala commentaries that were available when he was there. So they supposed to be at least 800 years old, right? And that's how he translated all them into Pali. So what would you think about this particular thing?
yeah. The first part of your question about this Prakrit, Magadhi aspect of the languages, I think Magadhi was probably one of the main Prakrit languages. In India, there were so many different Prakrit, that is regional dialects. So Magadhi was probably a main one. Then we have Asokan Prakrits. Some scholars call it the Asoka Pali. And Sinhala of that time, BCE period, Sinhala also is known as Sinhala Prakrit. So scholars think whatever Prakrit, whether it is the Asokan Prakrit or the Prakrit that was used in Venerable Mahinda's mother's area, that is the Avanti area, and the early Sinhala Prakrit were very close. People could probably understand without much difficulty. That is why probably uh, Venerable Mahinda, I said earlier, spent 6 months before coming to Sri Lanka when he was nominated as the missionary to go to Sri Lanka. Before coming, he spent with his companions 6 months in India. Yes, probably I think it was not just visiting with his mother. He would have probably learned the language of the island he was going to visit to spread Dhamma. Because those days, more than we know now, there were a lot of negotiations between the two countries, two kings. Delegations were going up and down, taking messages, taking gifts and presents to Asoka, from Asoka back to the Sri Lankan king, like that. So as there was much traveling between the two countries, there would have been some Sri Lankan people doing their business or some other work in the area. Mahinda spent those 6 months. Probably he would have learned the language of the island before coming here. This I think because Venerable, you know that when, according to our Vansakathas or our chronicles, when Mahinda came to the island, he met with the king of that time at Anuradhapura and talked to them. Thereafter, immediately from the following day, he started preaching Dhamma to hundreds of people within the royal palace and within the city, and then from outside of the city also people started coming in their thousands to listen to Mahinda Thero. So unless he spoke to them or communicated with them in the language of the island, it wouldn't have been possible for him to spread the Dhamma so fast in the island. So my feeling is that either the Sinhala of that time, the language of the island of that time would have been very close, not too different from what the Indian monks spoke at that time. Or Mahinda and his companions would have learned the language of the island well before coming here. Because so fast, within few months or few years' time, Buddhism spread all over the island like. We have the archaeological evidence that from Anuradhapura up to the southernmost part of the island also, Buddhism had spread within 1 or 2 years' time. How could it be possible unless they didn't have any language problem? Then the second part of your question about this Sihalatya Katha, wasn't that when
Yeah, that's right.
the Buddha Ghosa translated? In Buddha Ghosa's commentaries, like the prologue to Samantapasadika and some other Attakatha or commentaries, in the prologues as well as in the colophons, he has mentioned, thanked some monks of the Mahavihara in Anuradhapura for teaching him the Attakathas. Especially Buddha Ghosa mentions by name another uh, senior monk called Buddha Mitta. Under Buddha Mitta for a few years, he learned the Sinhala Attakathas. Especially, probably, I think, Venerable, we must name few of some of the most important Attakathas. That is, Buddha Ghosa mentions several times three Attakathas, that is Sinhala commentaries, Maha Attakatha, that is the great commentary. Then the second one he mentions as the Mahapacharya Attakatha. And the third one he names as the Kurundi Attakatha. So like this for centuries, these Attakathas survived in Sri Lanka.
Were they in Sinhala or were they in
They were in Sinhala. They were the three main Attakathas or commentaries translated from Magadhi into Sinhala by Venerable Mahinda and his group. So Mahattakatha is the great
now
one.
now now
Yeah,
the now the problem arises in this kind of a context. Now the Tipitaka was compiled into books uh,
yeah,
in the 5th century at the time of the King Walagamba in Sri Lanka. Okay,
yeah.
so as you say, the Sinhala translations were already compiled into palm leaf manuscripts way before the 5th century, right? So, what's the reason of why the Pali Tipitaka was not, you know, compiled into books, and why Sinhala commentaries were already in a kind of a manuscript or in manuscript forms? Was it because the Tipitaka
That
was,
is
yeah?
actually we can look at it this way. The Tripitaka texts, the canon, were maintained in the oral tradition. There was the oral transmission, good old, well established, well organized system of oral transmission they had developed in India. Buddhist monks followed that, adhered to that tradition of oral transmission. So there were so many monks who could learn by heart, memorize these texts. So even Mahinda and his fellow monks would have known all the Tripitaka by heart when they came here. Uh, and the Attakathas, probably the commentaries are different. Commentaries probably may have existed in written form also, not only in that I am not sure. Whatever it is, at Valagamba's time, that is venerable, the 1st century BCE, Valagamba, 1st century BCE, when the Tripitaka with the commentaries were committed to writing in palm leaf manuscripts in Sri Lanka. They clearly mention the whole Tripitaka, the 3 baskets of Dharma, with their commentaries were written down in books. In Pali, they use the term Pottakesu Likapesum. Pottakesu means in the books. Likapesu means they had written. They wrote down Tripitaka with the commentaries. Then, even up to the Buddha Ghosa's time, some monks would have learned them by heart, because unlike today, producing copies of palm leaf manuscripts is not an easy thing. They were not printed, it's manually done. So copies would have been quite hard to come by, to find. Therefore, some monks may have learned by heart. And at the Mahavihara, where Buddhaghosa stayed and wrote his commentaries in Anuradhapura, there has been a huge, well-organized library. Well-organized library. The tradition of writing had developed there. So the monks had there at the Mahavihara would have given the books, Attakathas or commentaries, which were already written in books to Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa would have learned his Sinhala and his Attakathas using those manuscripts. That's why he thanks his teachers at the Mahavihara so many times in his commentaries for helping him, for guiding him. And once Buddhaghosa, probably in the introduction or prologue to Samanta Pasadika, says, I completed this work taking the essence of that great commentary. Taking the essence, based on the essence of that great commentary, I completed this Attakatha. That is, there's a debate whether Buddhaghosa wrote himself, using his own knowledge and the library at the Mahavihara, those commentaries, whether he wrote or whether he translated. Our general feeling, belief is, even my personal belief is, as he has mentioned, used the word aropento vigata dosa. In Pali he says, I will divest those texts of their original language, that is the delightful language of the Sinhala island. Manoraman, Sinhala Basang, Manoraman Basang, he says. That is that Manorama, delightful Sinhala language of the island of Sinhalas, I am removing. Apanetwan means divesting, removing it from these texts. Then I put it onto or translate into the Tanti language. There, instead of Magadhi, sometimes he used the word Tanti also. That means the same thing. Tanti and Magadhi. Thus we have in commentaries and in general usage 3 names for this particular language. That is Magadhi, Pali and Tanti. But the Theravada monks of the Mahavihara tradition, of course, preferred to use the name Magadhi, because their belief was, Venerable Chandima, you may have heard that there was a popular saying, Sa Magadhi Mula Bhasa. So their traditional belief was Magadhi Bhasa, the language known as Magadhi was the Mula Bhasa, that is the original language of the human beings. They thought not only of Indian beings, Indian people, the whole humankind had Magadhi language as their original first language. Because of this respect, high regard for Magadhi, the Mahavihara monks wanted to preserve the scripture, Buddhist scripture, in that language. They believed that was the language of the Magadha Desa, where Buddha spent most of his time, and the Magadha language in which Buddha preached. Therefore, they had a high regard, high respect for this language, and Buddha Ghosa would have been invited or requested by the Mahavihara monks to translate this Sinhala Attakathas. There may be some reasons why it was so needed. What was the necessity to translate the Sinhala Attakathas into Pali or Magadhi?
Thank you for making clear the times. I had a misreading about the time the Tipitaka was actually canonized in books. That was the first century at the time of King
BCE.
Walagamba. And then, so Buddha Kosha had 400 years of time evolution of the text, right? The
Yeah.
Tipitaka text, so that he was able to, make the Pali commentaries. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the translation aspects now. First, let me ask you to sort of look at some of the challenges. Now, one of the biggest challenges that a translator may face could be language structures of the source language. Now, as a result, translators frequently have to add, remove, and rearrange the source words to effectively communicate in the target language. This is kind of a very commonplace thing to any translator, be that a religious text or any other text. So, have you ever come across this as a problem? If not, how would you see this as a problem, and then how does a translator, face this issue in translating, especially Buddhist text, Pali Buddhist text into English, or probably Sinhala this text into English?
Yes, personally, I also have faced with some challenges, but when we think about other translators or the translations by other writers, we can see that in general, most translators face number of challenges. I will maybe mention some of the challenges I face personally. Now, the scholars, especially who are translators, have mentioned that language structure is a main challenge. That is, if we take, for example, in English or some another modern language, they say that a translator must be familiar with, understand well, or he must master well the structure of the language. Actually, not one language, both the language, his target language as well as his source language. The structures of those languages he must understand. Here, structure means the linguists, the scholars use some words recently introduced to this science or art of language, like phonemes, morphemes, lexemes, syntax, and context. These are the main words. Now, there's no time to explain all these. They sound little bit like medicine, of course, to me. Phonemes, morphemes, lexemes, these are all part of the language. Morphemes, phonemes, lexemes, these are units of, if you take one word like abhivadana, abhivadeti, abhigachati, we can break this word into 2 or 3 parts like that. One would be a prefix, then the root, then the suffix, like that. They break into pieces.
It's like atomizing,
Yeah,
atomizing.
these units, and the linguists have given them various names like this: phonemes, morphemes, lexemes, etc. Even without knowing these technical terms, when we learn a language, now for example in Pali, learn the students of Pali know that there is something called um, declension of nouns, conjugation of verbs. So, in a language like English, also to some extent, verbs are conjugated, but not as many variations, many classifications, or many types of verbs as in Pali or Sanskrit. So, the scholars who learn these languages should understand what is a samasa, that is a compound. If you find a long sentence with about 20, 25, or 30 units put together, in hardly ever you find such long sentences in English. Now, if you take, for example, in one of the Sinhala books, I translated into English Amavatura. In the first chapter, you get a long sentence which runs for several pages. Several pages, one sentence without a stop. So, like that, if you come across such constructions uh, of sentences or language patterns in the text you are going to translate, then unless you have some understanding of the grammatical and linguistic aspects of the structure of that language, that will be a big challenge and difficulty. Then another very interesting aspect of interesting point in the challenges is the idioms and expressions. We know that in any living language especially, and in other languages also like Pali and Sanskrit, there are idioms, there are expressions. These are the common sayings quite often we use in a text or day-to-day spoken language also. There are idioms. For example, I thought of some very simple ones which we come across in the Pali text. Now, all the Buddhists know that at the beginning of any religious function or occasion, we have some Pali lines we repeat: Buddhang Saranam Gacchami. Buddhang Saranam Gacchami. I think this is idiomatic. This is a Pali idiom, Buddhang Saranam Gacchami. So some translators have rendered it in English as I go to the Buddha for refuge, like that. But that is not quite correct in a way. Now,
Yeah,
Gacchami
just
is.
to add on to that, I remember one
Mm,
monk told me
yeah,
in the United States that when he was explaining this to an American audience, and they were trying to say that we are not refugees.
yeah.
We don't want refugee kind of thing. We want something. Probably that is
Yeah,
one
yes,
of the
yes, yes.
problem
That,
with idioms.
yes. That's a new meaning to the word refuge. Sarana, actually, that is why these words can be translated in 2 or 3 or many different ways. Sarana is not only refuge in the modern sense of the word, but when they were first created or came into use, this word sarana may have meant not what it means to the American or modern audiences today. Then I was going to explain the other word, that's gachami. It is true that in Pali language, gacchami means go. I am going. Gacchami. Here, this doesn't mean in this idiomatic usage here, gacchami doesn't mean not really going or not really moving from place to place physically. Not physical movement is meant here. Buddhan saranang gacchami. To Buddha, that also probably for an English scholar, Western would be difficult because according to the Pali cases, Buddhang is in the second case, and it is used when you want to mean that you are going to meet someone, see someone, or to do something to someone or something. They use this form of the word Buddhang, Dhammang, Sanghang, like that. So if we just translate it, I go to Buddha for refuge, actually doesn't mean what should be meant in this idiomatic use. Similar sentence to this I remembered. Bahung ve saranang yanti. Bahung ve saranang yanti. There's a Pali stanza. Manusa bayatajita. The men who are scared, so scared or afraid. Bahung ve, many people go to the refuge. Go to refuge. There, instead of gachanti, in the Pali, the verb used is yanti. Yanti, they go. Bahung, there also yanti as the verb gacchami does not mean the real, actual, physically movement. Mentally, you beg for, you pray to Buddha. Here in the second case, people who are scared due to various reasons, frightened, they go to big trees, mountains, rivers, and worship at those places, make offerings, ask him for help. Sarana, ask him for help. So these translating such idiomatic phrases with the help of dictionary will not help. Dictionary gives mainly the first meaning or the main meaning, but the implied meaning, secondary meanings is hard to find in a dictionary. Then another example, a very common one, famous one, all the Buddhists know. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. There also, I think, we have idioms in Pali. Namo tassa. How do you translate this into English? This is a big challenge. Namo tassa. I didn't do much research on this, but I remember that Namo. We think that, oh, everybody knows what is Namo. But you ask everybody, anyone, to translate it, then you will see that it's really hard. It's really difficult to translate such a word. So unless you know the context, syntax, and the cultural background, also important. So Namo, I have seen some Western scholars translated this as hail, with exclamation mark, hail. I don't think that for a Buddhist this is good to translate Namo with hail. Then another highly esteemed Buddhist scholar monk has translated it as salute to Buddha. Salute. Namo. Then another scholar, I think I can't remember the name, but another scholar has used the English word for Namo, honors, my honors to, honor to. So like that you can find other words also, some other words also, which may
Do,
be close. Yeah.
Do you have a better translation instead of all?
Well,
Because
that's the
saluting,
problem.
saluting, hail. Some people
Well,
translate it to be homage. What's your own suggestion for that?
well, personally, actually, I don't have, to be honest, a suggestion. Um, because we using just one word as namo, uh, it is hard to translate
So
with
what you suggest is that scholars have to look at more of the figurative spin now, because the literal meaning and the figurative meaning has two aspects. So and something that is very interesting that you brought up is that it is not just translating like one word to the other word. I mean, target to source languages, depending on a dictionary like Pali English dictionary. It's more about knowing the concepts,
yeah,
the concept behind the language. So then that means a good Buddhist translator should be someone who understands the Buddhist concept thoroughly, right?
right,
Extensively. So that's a very big thing to many, I guess, because yeah.
yeah,
What are the
that's yeah,
other ones actually? Especially now, I can suggest one, as you can see in Dhammapada, Vanang Chindata Ma Rukkam.
yeah,
That's a good one too. Vanang
yeah,
Chindata Ma Rukkam. People might translate this to be cut the trees, cut the
yeah,
forest, right? So the Vanang in the first place means that the forest of defilements, but in the second one it says Ma Rukkam, but not the trees. So cut
yeah.
the forest of defilements, but not the
Yeah, that's
tree.
the thing. As
Yeah,
I also mentioned, the translator must be familiar with the religious, cultural, and social background. Unless he is familiar, he can make some serious errors, commit errors without knowing the cultural background. Then, venerable, with I must add one or two more examples for idioms. Is that I am taking some Pali terms that not from unknown suttas, from known things. In so many hundreds of suttas, we find the Pali words evang me suttam. That's an idiom, isn't that? So that's idiomatic. Evam me
it
suttam.
is.
But in Europe, maybe in their stories, if it is a folk tale or some historical tale, they can very easily start as once upon a time. Once upon a time. But when translating these Buddhist suttas, I have seen so many translators put the Evam Mesutang in many different ways. I heard. So I heard. The common one is, thus have I heard. Evam me sutan. Thus have I heard. I heard this. Like that in many different ways. So I don't know. I can't say which one is better here.
Yeah, but
But I'm just,
you see
yeah,
the differences, right?
yeah, differences and the problems with the idioms. Uh, then even Ekan Samayam Bhagava. That word also, then in many suttas, this opening lines are almost the same. They have become idiomatic. They have become idioms like. So we can discuss how to avoid such problems later on. Uh, then,
So you are suggesting to be a little bit cautious when
yeah,
translating, even these tiny like little things, right?
yeah, these
Yeah, yeah,
small things, sometimes although they appear externally at a glance simple, but they matter a lot when
yeah.
it comes to
True.
religious texts. Even in Pali, you get these prepositions and other uh, words of one, two letters like apicha, nu, ko, these things. I have seen Western translators just disregard, just gloss over these such nuances, the little words. For example, Katan Saraniyang Vitinametva. These words you may be familiar with in many suttas. As somebody goes to meet with Buddha, and after exchanging greetings, uh, he sits down at a respectable distance, respectable side like that. They think, so for Katan Saraniyam Vitina Metva has been translated with two words like having exchanged greetings. Katan Saraniyam Vitina Metva, to my mind, there are more meanings in that. You can, if possible, to make it clearer. Here, I think they exchange words which are friendly and memorable words. Saraniyam, I think Katan Sarani, memorable words to show their good, kind-hearted friendship. Not if you just say exchange greetings and sat down at the side, that is not giving the full meaning.
It looks to us that they have ignored all that and then just said they
Yeah,
have
there are so
exchanged.
many translations who ignore these little words. Then I notice in sutta, like the famous Madhupindika Sutta. There are so many such idioms and very interesting terms. There is one instance where a Brahmin names Dandapani. He meets with Buddha, goes to see the Buddha, and he is taking his walking stick wherever he goes, and leaning on his walking stick. He didn't sit down. He was a little bit proud. So he talks to Buddha, asks what is the teaching of Buddha, what is his King Vado Buddha, what is his view or his philosophy. Then Buddha explained briefly, but somewhat difficult to understand terms, a short expression Buddha makes about his teaching. Then Dandapani did not agree. He did not accept the Buddha's words obediently or as a faithful listener. He just said, okay, is that so? He shakes his head and leaves Buddha. In the sutta, it goes like this. Evang buddhe dandapani sakko sisang okam petva jivha nillo letva tivisakang nalatikang nalate vuttha petva dande molubba pakkami. Then he, Dandapani Sakya, this person named Dandapani Sakya, shook his head, put out his tongue, and raised his eyebrows until 3 lines appeared on his forehead, and left leaning on his stick. That is the meaning. So one English translator has put it into English like this. When this was said, the Sakya Dandapani shook his head, pulled out his tongue. Here, Jivha Nillo Letva, this translator takes it as pulled out his tongue, then and shaking, then showing 3 forks on his forehead, went away leaning on his stick. So these two important terms here, jivha nillo letva, putting out his tongue, and raising his eyebrows, 3 lines appeared on the forehead. So his disregard, almost insulting Buddha without caring for what Buddha said, he left Buddha. So there is some sarcasm also here, sarcastic, his action. But another translator translates the same line like this. When this was said, Dandapani the Sakyan, shaking his head, wagging his tongue. The former one says he pulled out his tongue. But this second translator says wagging his tongue, raising his eyebrows so that his forehead over wrinkled in three furrows on his forehead, wrinkled in three furrows, left leaning on his. So one says, the first one said, three forks, showing three forks on his forehead. This one uses wrinkled in three furrows. Then the first one, whereas the first one for the tongue used the word pulled out his tongue. The second one says wagging his tongue. So you see the differences.
How
That
come
makes it.
how come two people got to be wagging and then pulling out?
Pulling out. There is some highly, somewhat respected translators. The second one, of course, I think it's a Burmese monk, Bhikkhu Thanissaro. You may have heard. He has made many translations of Pali texts into English. Um, I use his translation online,
Yeah,
on
I
the
think he has a
internet.
website called Access to English. I think it's an American monk, I
So
guess.
for a long time, I have been using his translations because as a translator, this is outside our topic a little bit.
Yeah.
He helps the reader by providing enough notes. I think
Mhm.
that is, you have a question regarding this also. Okay, Venerable, we can, if you like, move on to the next topic.
Yeah, 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 sure.
Yeah.
Professor Meddegama, we have a time issue, so we'll a little bit speed up. Now,
Yeah.
still we've been talking about challenges. Now, what I understood was that we were talking about some challenges like translating language structures from source language into target language, where in which we got into other things too. So we also talked about idiomatic expressions, and we also a little bit touch upon with the humor. Now, we have places in the Pali Canon where we see humor. Are you happy enough that that translations you've already seen so far have translated the humor in the target language to that level?
Well, briefly, personally, I haven't come across such situations related to humor or sarcasm. But in Buddhist literature, we know that there are so many instances or stories which create humor. But some scholars think that in the scriptures or sutras, discourses, you don't come across many humorous situations like that. Very few, but I know that, like if you take the story of Bhikkhu Tullatis and some actions of, as mentioned in the Vinaya, the group of 6 monks, Chabagya monks, there are some situations like that. Then some subtle type of humor is there. For example, if you take the story of King Ajatasattu, who went to meet with Buddha, accompanied by uh, the doctor, his royal doctor called Jivaka, the way they got ready to visit Buddha, it creates the humor. When you see how this powerful king at the time was so scared to step out of his palace to go to visit Buddha. And in their preparation, they selected an army entourage consisting only of women soldiers to accompany at night, late night, for King Ajatasattu to go to see Buddha. Even when they arrived at the monastery where Buddha was surrounded by his monks, disciples preaching, uh, it was so quiet. The Jivaka had told Ajatasattu, "Oh, uh, Your Majesty, there are thousands of monks here." But the king didn't hear a sound. He was so scared. The place was so quiet. So there it creates, it suggests, humor is suggested there. Same thing, how uh, Angulimala was brought from the forest by Buddha. Angulimala was ordained and sitting by the side of Buddha, and the king goes with his army to catch this killer, and he just stops by Buddha, thinking that, "Oh God, let Lord Buddha stop my going to the forest with the soldiers to catch this robber." Mentally, that is what king had in his mind, who just he just pretended he was out of faith, out of devotion, going to worship Buddha. But actually, what was in his mind was that Buddha might save him from going. So there are some humorous situations in Buddhist literature, but in sutras, long sutras, you don't come across such situations much. That is what I have to say
Okay.
about yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mistranslations. Now, along these lines, if a translator is not concerned about semantic, lexical, syntactic, other language, I would say, issues, including cultural awareness, then there is more likely a mistranslation is going to happen. So, I think we sort of discussed about mistranslations indirectly, but what are your thoughts about why uh, why we could see some mistranslations of the Buddhist text in our language? We don't want to mention XYZ because there are living translators too. So, what are the reasons? But some people they think that it could be due to different things like Orientalism, modernism, colonialism, because of these things people will actually sort of bias, sort of prepare to do that. But there may be other reasons too. So what are the fundamental reasons behind the lack of technical knowledge, lack of knowing the Buddhist languages, Buddhist philosophy? What are the other common reasons that could have crept into that skill? I mean, it's not a skill, I would say, that bad virtue.
Yeah, in addition to what you just mentioned about mistranslation, I feel that uh, the personal mental situation or attitude, personal attitude of the person translating also matters. If right from the beginning his mentality is that, oh, what I am going to translate, I don't believe in what is expressed here, what is included here, or if he has no real respect for the message, then the possible result would be not would not be a good translation. If he has disrespect for the author of the original text. In the case of Buddhist text, if a person who does not like Buddha or his teachings is translating, that could lead to the result of a mistranslation. And as you mentioned, more important is for a translator to produce a good translation. I think a thorough, very good knowledge of the original language as well as the target language. One must master well both the languages, the source language and the target language. If with an imperfect knowledge of these languages, one can't do a proper translation. Now, for example, uh, some authors mention number one tool for a good translator is the dictionary. That is true. But dictionaries always don't help. Dictionaries can mislead the translator also. For example, if you look up in the most famous Pali English dictionary, Rhys David's dictionary, you see that some important Pali words like Nibbana, Buddha, Sansara, Karma, and especially Dhamma or Dharma. If you look up in the dictionary, Rhys David's dictionary, it is very hard to get a simple a single word meaning for this, for the word Dhamma. I think he devotes about 4 pages under the word Dhamma. Buddha also like that. So these key important words, the dictionary gives many references. That's true. That's very helpful for a researcher. For a translator, translators cannot depend much on dictionaries. I just remember one example in the, I think it is in the Madhupindika Sutta, as I remember it, there's a term, Sala Raja Mule Nisiditva, Nisanna. Buddha went to the Mahavana for his daytime retreat to spend a few hours in peace, in seclusion, and sat down under the Salaraja, a tree called Salaraja. One translator, I think going by the dictionary, uh, translates it as a huge sala tree. Sala Rajamula, huge sala tree. Another translator I have seen translate translates it as a royal sala tree. You see that grasped the word Raja. Raja could be royal. So Sala Raja for me is neither royal sala tree nor a huge tree. No, Sala Raja probably, to my mind, I feel that Sala Raja in that great forest into which Buddha retired to rest for a while, there was especially huge, the main attraction, that Sala tree was the main attraction. So everybody who went into that forest would have gone to see or sit under that tree. That's why they have named especially. It is not a royal. It may have been a huge tree. That's what I thought. Why one person looks at it as a huge tree, another person sees it as a royal tree. So there are some nuances and differences in translating such words. When
Prof,
you look at these translations, you come back to so many questionable translations like that.
at the same time, somebody might, I mean, we can also think that there are many dictionaries. Like if you look at Pali English Dictionary by the Politics Society, and there were other dictionaries followed by, like a critical Pali dictionary by V. Trenkner, which was actually revised and continuously edited by Anderson and Smith. And we also know there are other books like Dictionary of Pali Proper Names by G.V. Malasekara, and there are
Yeah.
many other dictionaries. Probably, at least if a translator can take a look at of many of these prestigious, reputable dictionaries,
Yes,
at
you are
least
right.
at least can escape from being, named as a bad translator, a poor
not to be
translator.
attached just to one dictionary only.
Yeah.
If,
So
as you mentioned, there are so many Pali English dictionaries, and in other languages also, like from
French,
Sri Lanka,
German. Mhm.
Sinhala Pali English dictionaries, like that. We can use the dictionaries, and the best thing would be to learn Pali from a very good scholar of Pali,
Under an expert.
and an expert, real expert, and then to read before starting. Now there's a tendency for many people, especially in a country like Sri Lanka, just after learning a language little bit, then he or she thinks, oh, now I know this language, first thing I must do is translating a book. They start translating books as soon as they just get the hang of a language little bit, not an expert knowledge of that language. That could cause much harm to the literature, Buddhist or whatever literature. Then, with regard to the mistranslation, if we come back a little bit, I think it is better to consult experts in this profession, if possible. If I am translating a book, if I can consult a friend or a teacher or a colleague who is quite knowledgeable, and get the opinion, a second or third opinion, that could help to avoid these mistranslations.
Okay,
Comparison with other translations also.
great. Let's get into the last question. The last question is about opportunities. So we've been talking about translations of Buddhist texts, challenges. Now we're moving on to uh, opportunities. Now, opportunities are being talked and discussed here in the lens of suggestions for somebody to develop translation skills. Those who are already work as a translator, those who willing to translate Buddhist texts in the future. But we have loosely talked about some of the suggestions. As the former director of translation projects at Siba, Kandy, Sri Lanka, what are your suggestions, like healthy approaches for a translator? Now, we talked about one thing, consulting experts, probably Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and all these textual scholars, and also be concerned about dictionaries. Of course, dictionaries and encyclopedias are really good, but you need to consult, you need to refer to many dictionaries, I mean, the good ones, comprehensive ones, and also cultural awareness. We talk a little bit about it.
Yeah,
So
that's
probably you
very
can sort
important.
of explain cultural awareness and some other healthy approaches for translators or translators to be in the future.
Regarding this subject, I think without a proper knowledge of the cultural background, we can't do a good translation of any text. Especially, we must know, we must understand the culture of the people among whom this text has arisen, or the author's cultural background. We must have some understanding. Buddhist texts we know, but there are some who don't know of the background. Even some don't know. I have seen some persons, of course, I don't want to mention from which country, they don't know. When they see an image of the Buddha, they question, who was Buddha? Was he a man or was he a woman? I don't know whether anyone has asked you this question, but some visitors to Sri Lanka have asked this question. We took them to a very classical type of site, with a very good ancient image house of Buddha, looking at, went on admiring, like, with some pleasure, looking at the face of Buddha, turned back and asked, "Oh, whether Buddha was a man or a woman?" That shows, this is an example. Some people don't have much understanding of the historical or cultural background, cultural situation in translating. When it comes to translating a text like the text of the Vinaya Pitaka, especially, I think you need to have a good understanding of the culture of India and community of bhikkhus, their lifestyle, how they lived at the time of Buddha. Then only you can understand why Buddha had to lay down so many rules of discipline. Without that cultural background, knowledge of the culture and implications bring out by these many rules, one can't translate properly, because this is not only for the Western or American writers. I think in our own countries, in India and Sri Lanka, in the past, from the time of Buddha Ghosa's time in Sri Lanka, so many times many different authors have produced supporting literature to this text to help understand well properly, because they explain words. That's why we have hundreds of books by the name Sanna and Gatapada. They explain word by word, because without the help of this supporting literature, it's hard even for a scholar to understand the text. So if a translator can use some of these tikas and gatapadas and sannas, we call in our language, that will be very helpful for the translator to make a good, to avoid the difficulties and challenges. Now, for example, this text you mentioned earlier, written by Venerable Buddha Ghosa, called Visuddhi Magga, Path of Purification. Buddha Ghosa actually is supposed to have written it on his own, not a translation. Some scholars think maybe he may have used another older text, smaller text, a brief one, which the Mahavihara gave him, and working on that and expanding that shorter one, Buddha Ghosa may have written the Visuddhi Magga. So from the time he wrote that, on many occasions, our scholars have produced sannas and paraphrases, dictionaries to help understand the Visuddhi Magga. For example, one of our famous kings in the 12th century wrote in Sinhala language a paraphrase to the Visuddhi Magga Sanne, it is called. So that is how we could avoid some of these problems by using such helpful works, like not only dictionaries but the Sanna, Gatapada and other glossaries.
So, adding on to that, I have a question for the flip side of the cultural awareness. Now, as we all know, that we have to be seriously looking at and looking into the then culture, the society that was in India, to get a good sense of what it was. But what if somebody might say, we are in the 21st century? Now, uh, I mean, we are doing this for the contemporary society, as you said about the refuge, right? People might misunderstand. So, how does someone meet the demands of a contemporary society of a Buddhist text, in addition to not tarnishing the pristine nature of the essence of the Buddhist teaching? Let's say now there are some of the things that were recommended that were mainly catered to the Indian society at that time. So, But as a translator, you don't want to give a bad impression about the society into the contemporary society. So it's kind of a win-win situation for a translator. It could be. So what do you think about the flip side of being into the culture? Because now we are in a certain culture, Sri Lankan culture, other cultures. So how do we bring some of the, I would say, controversial things that happen in the text into the present cultures, because we want to be aware of the present culture also, in order to bring those cultural things. It's kind of a paradox, but what are your thoughts about it?
Well, that is not easy to, that question is not an easy one to explain briefly. But with a good translation of a particular text, the main idea is communicating the message in that text. So if there will be a clash culturally, then the reader or the audience must be warned, and if the translator could give explanations from time to time in his notes, as I saw recently, the English translation of Buddha Ghosa's work Visuddhimagga by Bhikkhu, I think Jnanatiloka,
Yanamoli, or
Jnanamoli probably.
yeah, the path of purification, the very famous
Yeah,
one.
path
Yeah,
of purification. The translator monk gives throughout the book so many, I think hundreds of explanatory notes, footnotes, he explains, which help the reader, the modern reader. From the point of view of a modern reader, this translator has given these footnotes. So by reading his notes, we can understand the difficulties, and sometimes he helps why Buddha did this, why this was so advised to do it this way, or with regard to this kammatthana or topics of meditation, he gives long explanations. So a translator could do that. And otherwise, if the original text is translated as it is, a modern reader must not get things confused, I think. So, if in the preface, or as Buddha Ghosa himself has done in his prologues to his Attakathas, he gives some background of the text, background of himself, and what his uh, objectives are, like that. The translator also could explain his objectives, and he must understand. I think another important point is that the translator must have a very good understanding of his audience, the expectations of the audience. Without knowing the expectations of the audience, a translator can't do a reasonable translation.
and that entails communication skills too, right? Even though
Yes,
if you don't know how to write it, covering what the audience, expectations are about. So it's a problem to communication part, right? I mean, how to put in the proper language, how to put in the proper context, right?
yes, these language problems are also there. But as I first mentioned, if the translator is good, has a good understanding and mastery of the two languages concerned, he can avoid some difficulties. And the other thing, most important thing, is that with regard to the translation of Buddhist texts, I think that as Buddha himself during his lifetime uh, reminded his audience so many times, whatever happens in society, whatever happens in the community of monks, whatever problems they face, whatever questions people come and ask Buddha, And in the so many discourses he has given, his main objective purpose was to show the path to purification, or path to uh, get gain enlightenment or nibbana, to end dukkha or suffering in samsara. So this message, whatever the sutra, there may be so many long debates, discussions, controversies, but the final outcome of Buddha's preaching was showing the way to Nibbana, showing the way to end suffering in samsara. So to even to modern audiences, we have to explain this. This is, we must keep in mind what the Buddha's objective was. Then I think such controversial problems
Can be
wouldn't
avoided.
arise. Yeah,
Okay, great. So we come to the conclusion now. Professor Meddegama, do you have anything to add on that you think you may have missed out on, and you can conclude uh, everything here?
I think if we meet again in a discussion like this with regard to translated works of Tripitaka, we can discuss and consider some other related problems. I think this is not a very, probably for the general audience, this would be a very interesting discussion, because we didn't normally, in some discussions, they always come up with stories and things like that. But this was somewhat a technical type of discussion. Thank you for inviting me for your program.
Thank you very much, dear Dhamma folks. Today, joined with me was Professor Udaya Meddegama. He was formerly a professor at the Department of Sinhala of University of Peradeniya, and also was a visiting professor at SOAS, University of London, and many other colleges. Thank you, Professor Meddegama, and I wish you good health and safety and peace throughout the time. At the same time, Dhamma folks, we have another interview coming up this Thursday with an activist from Montreal, Canada. It's about helping refugees with a new aspect. Stay tuned with that. Thank you. Have a good night. Have a good day.
Yeah,
Take care.
good, good day to you, Venerable. Thank you for inviting me again. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof.